So today I'm going to be talking about how addictions has affected my family. So growing up, my family was always pretty close between my grandparents, my auntie, my uncle, my cousins, and my mom, well, my parents and me and my brother. So my cousins, Devin and Sarah, Devin is actually 2 years older than me and Sarah's the same age as me, and our moms are sisters. So growing up, my family and my grandparents lived in Moose Jaw. However, Sarah and Devin and my auntie and uncle actually moved around pretty frequently. They lived in Alberta quite often. However, we always made it work. We would visit them on holidays. They would come and visit us on holidays. So we were still fairly close. And then actually when I was in grade 6, they ended up moving to Regina. So we were even closer then because we were always seeing each other whether we were coming to Regina or they were coming to Moose Jaw. So they did not live here very long because my uncle actually got laid off. And when he got laid off, he found a job out in the area of Gravelbourg and Assiniboia. So they found a house out at Thompson Lake. And Thompson Lake is pretty important to my family just because our parents grew up at Thompson Lake, and my grandparents also actually grew up around the area in La Flèche and Gravelbourg. So around this time, I was probably in grade 7, just ending grade 7, going into grade 8 when they moved out there, and Devin would have been 14 or 15. So he was already drinking with friends and going to parties at this age. My auntie and uncle allowed it to happen. They would supply the alcohol for him. That was just their choice. They wanted, and they were okay with that. So then we started school back in Moose Jaw for the school year. And I remember not too long into the school year, my cousin Devin actually got caught doing drugs. And he had told my auntie that he was just using marijuana. And I remember it was a huge ordeal because my mom and my auntie were on the phone for quite a while about it, and they were discussing it and things that they could do about it. And they had discussed rehab at one point, but I remember my auntie saying, well, if it's just marijuana, he doesn't need to go to rehab or to detox. So I remember my mom asking to talk to Devin on the phone, and she said, I'm not trying to get you in more trouble, but I need you to know that if you're doing other drugs, you might actually need to go to a detox center to get the help you need because the withdrawals will be so severe. So Devin admitted that he was doing some more serious drugs. He was actually using acid, he was doing mushrooms, and using cocaine as well. So at the age of 15, he went into detox and rehab for the first time. When he came out, he was actually doing pretty good. He stayed out of drugs for quite a while, but he eventually fell back into them. However, he didn't seem to get into too much trouble when he was using them. The odd time he would get pulled over with them, and then he would get charged with them, but nothing really ever happened. He would get community service or things like that. He would be on probation sometimes. It was super on and off from the time that I was in grade 8 to the time that I was until now, honestly. So around this time that I went into grade 9, Sarah was actually getting into drugs as well. So she was the same age as me, and she got into drugs a lot quicker and harder than Devin did. She used harder drugs quicker and was getting charged with them pretty quick as well. She actually was dating a guy at one point, and while they were getting high, he ended up beating her up and breaking her nose. And I remember thinking that maybe this would be it and she would want to get better. However, it wasn't, and it took a little bit longer. So Sarah had gotten arrested a couple times with drugs, but her really only punishment was that she was on probation. But honestly, nothing really ever would come of it too often because she was never getting checked on out there in that area. So she actually ended up following the drugs wherever they were. So she would come to Regina, and at this point I was in my first year of university here in Regina. She would go to Moose Jaw, or sometimes she would even go to Swift Current. And I remember when she was in Moose Jaw, she actually had an overdose and nobody really told me about it until a couple months after. And I remember just being so stunned because to me, like, it was so serious, but to them, like, they honestly just expected it. And my grandparents still live in Moose Jaw, and at this point they have a keyless entry onto their house, so it's just like the pin and you just like punch it in and then you can get into the door. And I remember they had actually changed that, and they took their spare key inside once they found out she was there. And downstairs my grandpa has an office, and in his office he has some guns because he's a hunter. And in my whole lifetime I've known 3 times that he's ever had to lock the door, and the first 2 times was when they had some people staying in their house for them, like house sitting, and the 3rd time was when they found out Sarah was in Moose Jaw. So there was like a serious lack of trust like in the family, and it showed a lot, especially when Sarah was coming to Moose Jaw. My grandparents go down south every winter, and they often have people house sitting, and they actually told their house sitters, like, if this girl, they showed her a picture and said, if this girl comes to the door, don't let her in, don't answer the door, like, don't do anything, just ignore it. So I remember one time Sarah was actually in Swift Current and I was in Regina, and she had messaged me, and I had assumed that she was going to be in Regina and wanting to come over to my house. And I had been warned, like, don't let her come over because my parents and my grandparents didn't want her to steal anything. So I just continued the conversation with her, and she actually was in Swift Current and she needed money. So she was messaging me, asking me for money. And I remember just sitting there being so shocked because I knew she wasn't doing good, but I didn't know she was doing that bad. And as a first-year university student, I was like, what money does she expect me to give to her? And so I didn't answer her because I didn't want to say no, because I didn't want her to lash out on me, but I also didn't want to say yes to her. So a couple weeks later, she was back in Moose Jaw, and at this point, she was driving a vehicle, and she had seen the police driving as well. So she had parked the vehicle on some random street and started walking because she was scared that she was going to get caught because she was on probation and should have been at her house. And so she called my mom and told her that she needed her to come pick her up. And my mom was telling me the story about it the next morning. So I guess what had happened is that Sarah had lied. So my mom was like, I'm not coming to get you because you lied to me. So the next day, my auntie had texted my mom, and they got into a huge fight, and they actually just like stopped talking, and my auntie said that she didn't want to be a part of the family anymore. So they didn't talk for quite some time after this, and at this point, Devin was like laying pretty low. He wasn't getting into too much trouble with anything. It was morely just Sarah. However, a couple weeks later, there was actually a robbery at a bar in the area that they live in. And a couple days later, Devin had gotten pulled over by the police because he was connected to the robbery. And I remember my auntie didn't tell my parents or my grandparents like what he was charged with. And they just kept saying like they didn't know. So I just, out of curiosity, Googled it, because normally when I Googled it, nothing came up because it was never like serious enough charges. However, this one was. He actually had 6 charges pressed against him. He had 4 drug charges and 2 weapon charges. And this was just like a huge shock to our family because he was laying pretty low and he wasn't getting into very much trouble, and he was doing good. He was living on his own. He had a job and everything. So at this point, Sarah and Devin were both getting into a lot of trouble. Sarah had some pretty serious drug charges against her, and they both needed a lawyer to go to court. However, they could not have the same lawyer because they incriminated one another. So Devin went to court first, and his got adjourned for quite a while before he had to enter a plea. So he pled guilty, and he was served 18 months of house arrest. And he's actually still on those 18 months of house arrest, and he hasn't been in any trouble since. He actually is allowed to work on his house arrest, and he now has like a couple hours a week for like free time, so like to go get a haircut or to go to the store and stuff like that. When Sarah went to court for the first time, hers was also adjourned, and in between the time that it was adjourned and she had to go back, she went to detox, And she actually stayed at detox the whole time, which was the first time she has ever done that. And when she went to court, they gave her 50 hours of community service. After this, she agreed to go to rehab. So she went to rehab and finished her time there. And when she finished, she moved out on her own and she actually moved to Moose Jaw. Now, over the summer, I was also living in Moose Jaw at my parents' house while I was working. And I knew that she was working at Superstore, but I didn't really know if I should try to look for her or try to avoid her, because at this point I didn't really know who she was anymore. I didn't see her very often, and when I did, she just wasn't who she used to be. And I actually ended up seeing her one time while I was shopping, and she came up and gave me the biggest hug, and she was so talkative and she was so happy and bubbly, and I don't think I've ever seen her like that in her entire life, even before she was addicted to drugs. And it was really good to see her like this, and we had quite a long conversation, and every time I went to Superstore after that, I would look for her and we would end up talking, have a conversation, and she would even go up to my mom and hug my mom, and they didn't have a very good relationship after my mom would go pick her up that night. So yeah, it was really weird. It was a weird experience to see her like that, but I'm really glad that she is clean, and she's actually still clean to this day, which is super exciting. So yeah, that's my family's story about addiction.